This is the first in a series of videos in which we will discuss the problem of no-go zones as presented by Rahim Kassam in his book No-Go Zones: How Sharia Law is Coming to a Neighborhood Near You, published in August 2017. In his foreword to the book, Nigel Farage says that the topic of no-go zones is characterized by half-truths, denials and rejections by the established media. Rahim Kassam was careful not to antagonize the inhabitants of the areas with video cameras when going there, and he timed his visits carefully. In a few cases, he managed to avoid violence and riots by a matter of hours only. Farage thinks that conservatives, liberals, teachers, students, reporters, editors and activists should read the book. He stresses Kassam's reliable sources, the high level of his interviews, and his access to data on things like crime and imprisonment that are hard to come by. If we now turn to Kassam's text, the first chapter is called The Unsettled Debate. Kassam here says that there is still a reluctance to talk openly about the topic of no-go zones, although there can be no doubt anymore that they do exist. People's careers have been ruined because they spoke the truth about no-go zones or just asked tough questions about these areas. People are driven away from the topic because of fear, and established media ignore it because they want to create harmony on the left and division on the right. For a lot of people, Islam itself has become a no-go zone, Kassam says. Kassam was himself born and raised in a Muslim family, and he has many Muslim friends. For this reason, it was all the more important for him to collect valuable data to be able to assess the situation objectively. 40% of British Muslims want Sharia law in the West, for example. That's an indisputable fact. And 1 in 5 men serving time in prison in the UK is a Muslim, although Muslims make up only 5% of the population. Ghettoization and segregation generally may make younger generations of Muslims in the West more susceptible to extremist tendencies. Radicalization is often driven by money being pumped into mosques and madrasas, which are Islamic centers of learning, and friends, family and colleagues often turn a blind eye when faced with hardline views, as Kassam puts it. In 2015, at the height of the migrant crisis, the Saudi government pledged to build 200 mosques in Germany, instead of welcoming Syrians into Saudi Arabia. These mosques tend to be fundamentalist, anti-Western and anti-Jewish. The building of all these mosques with their fundamentalist agenda attracted almost no media attention. The same is true of the Cologne sexual assaults on New Year's Eve 2015. More than 1,000 men sexually assaulted, raped and mugged German women in front of Cologne's central station, and around 2,000 sexual assaults and robberies were reported to the police across major German cities. There was nothing on this for several days in the Western media. Kassam hesitates to use the word cover-up for the media's reactions to the Cologne incident. He prefers to talk about disbelief and unwillingness, and he compares this to journalists' attitudes to the topic of no-go zones. People tend to think that there can be no such thing as no-go zones today in Western Europe and in the US. Kassam calls the no-go zones an almost psychological and physical enslavement perpetrated upon Muslims, young Muslims especially. A failure to report on this is much more damaging than what the most bigoted Westerners could imagine as punishment for the adherents of Islam, he says. Normal people are being converted, perverted and radicalized in the name of the world's fastest growing religion and its political goals. The so-called progressives shout out their tolerance for these people and accuse critics, including Muslim critics, of the radicalization taking place, of Islamophobia. If not addressed correctly, the no-go zones will continue to spread until they overpower the establishments that oppose them, Qassam says. The fight against the no-go zones is a fight both for reformist Muslims and for Western civilization. In Chapter 2, entitled What Happens in Europe, Qassam states that a document prepared by the French government claims there are 750 no-go zones in France. The question is how to define the no-go zone. There is no clear answer. The name indicates that this is a place that you should not visit. Qassam defines no-go zones as an area in which the risk of being attacked is higher than elsewhere in the city or country. The police may require authorization or acceptance from a religious figure or community leader to enter the area, or the rule of law may have broken down or been supplanted by a foreign set of rules. Qassam speaks of the necessity for a gradation of the no-go zones. You may be able to enter a certain area, but you may still risk your safety by doing so. Many of the no-go zones, which are labeled sensitive urban areas in the official language, are similar to Harlem or the Bronx from the 1980s, but others are not. Usually, non-Muslims can enter majority Muslim areas without fear. But when the government becomes involved, it's a different situation altogether. Firefighters, ambulance workers, and even social workers meet with hostility and violence. The term no-go zone can mean either that ordinary people stay away from the place out of fear, or that the representatives of the state enter only under exceptional circumstances. The last one is true of the no-go zones that Qassam discusses in his book. Younger Muslims in the West tend to be more fundamentalist than their immigrant mothers and fathers, Qassam says. The trend suggests that rather than integrating, the Muslims will segregate even further. These areas often fall prey to exploitative leaders. By accusing all critics of no-go zones of Islamophobia, the liberal left supports further segregation, Qassam says. In our next video, we will start looking at individual European no-go zones.